أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله.
Hi, I'm Ted. I'm Secretary of the Reading University Muslim Society, or Reading ISOC as it's now called. And this is Sean, he's the President of the Reading Atheist Humanist Society.
Yeah, I was just thanks for coming. And just to start everything off, we'd just like to do a quick poll. Just raise your hand. Who of you agree with the motion?
The motion's on there.
It's the only rational solution. That's it. Raise your hand, agree with the motion. And, okay. Awesome. Okay, if you are undecided, and if you are against the motion. Alright.
Oh, sorry guys, just an announcement. People turn your phones off, put them off silent, and if you come in at the back, can you tell them to sit somewhere close to the back so they don't... Thank you.
I'm Peter. I'm going to be sharing. I'm going to be sharing the debate today. We're going to go through a simple structure. Basically, each speaker will have 20 to 25 minutes to speak. The first speaker will be decided by the close of this point. Then they'll each have 8 minutes to rebuttal. Then we'll have a big long Q&A session where everybody can ask all the questions they want to ask to speakers. Now, today the motion is atheism is the only rational option. I want to stress the fact that rationality then will be addressed, but rationality is to be quite a complicated notion, and therefore other speakers will clarify that. And the option is what you're given here, and that's why we poll at the beginning is to see which option you will eventually decide, and we'll poll again at the end to see if anybody has changed their views in any way, substantially. So first, I'd like to introduce Bob Churchill, my dad, who is the head of membership and promotion of the British Humanist Association, which he joined in 2008. He's also a fundraiser for that organization. Bob studied philosophy at the University of Warwick and at Queen's University in Canada. He has worked in both communications and marketing. He also promotes humanism via events and publications, events such as this, and joining with local humanist groups, such as the Atheist and Humanist Society and other such humanist groups in the country. In 2006, he campaigned against the education bill quite thoroughly, and he's known for that, and against the indictment of children into a faith that they are presumed to be believing in. And so this is proven to be quite an interesting debate when faith was a big problem in this country. Second speaker, or maybe first speaker, that's the point. On my right is Anza Tzortzis. Yes?
That's fine.
Can I introduce you?
No.
I will too.
I don't want to. Thank you.
Well, that's not very nice. I prepared all of this.
Well, they have to know it's my name.
Okay. Are you Greek from Greek descent?
I'm British.
You converted to Islam in 2002? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to say that at least. Basically, thanks everyone for coming in today, especially because of the weather. I don't know if we have to blame God for it, but that's up for you to decide. We will start. So I'll be asking when this answer. Both. Which side do you choose?
Heads.
Okay. So I'll let it go down. I won't interfere. It's God's choice. It's tails. So you will be started.
Thank you.
And you have 20 to 25 minutes. It's up to you. I'll be giving a 5-minute warning.
Très bon. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers, sisters and friends, I'm going to start as Muslims do in the name of God. In alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. For those who don't know Arabic, who understand what that means, I said, may the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. Today's debate, atheism is the only rational conclusion. Obviously, I'm against this motion, but before I get into the thick of my argument, I think I need to discuss what do we mean by atheism in the first place. When we go to the dictionary of philosophy, atheism is a knowledge claim. It's a knowledge claim that there are no gods or a God. So in light of this, I'm going to argue that if we use the rational method of thinking, we will conclude that not only is atheism not only the rational conclusion, but also that its claims are unreasonable in light of philosophical and scientific evidence we have at hand. So to argue this, I'm going to present two key positive, cogent arguments for the existence of God. One, God makes sense of the origins of the cosmos, of the whole universe. Number two, God makes sense of the fine-tuning of the universe to permit our existence. And what I'm going to do in this presentation is also include some key atheist counter-arguments and respond to them, because I really want to have a positive conversation during the question and answers. I want to transcend the outdated cliches that exist on both sides of the debate. I really want us to connect as human beings today. Is that alright, you guys? Good. Let's go straight to the first argument. God makes sense of the origins of the universe. Now, brothers, sisters, and friends, we have all asked the same questions. Why does something exist rather than nothing? Even the Quran mentions something similar, the Quran being the book of the Muslims. It says, or do they think the universe came out of nothing? Now, if we respond to this perennial question by saying that there's a cause for the universe, or claiming that the universe is uncaused, then we could then investigate which is the most reasonable conclusion. Now, if the universe is uncaused, in the words of the famous atheist Bertrand Russell, he said on a radio program, the universe is a brute fact. It's just a brute reality, no beginning, no end, full stop. So if it is uncaused, therefore eternal, it would mean the universe has an infinite history of past events. That's the logical implication. If a universe is eternal, therefore it has an infinite history of past events. But we know this can't be the case, because the infinite just doesn't make sense in the real world. As the philosophers say, there is no ontological export of the concept of the infinity into the real world. You probably don't even know what that means. Nor do I, but it makes me sound really cool. Okay? But let me explain what it means. Imagine we have an infinite amount of Bob Churchills in this room. Okay? Now, whether we like it or not is under discussion, okay? Now, if we have an infinite amount, if we take 10 Bob Churchills away, how many Bob Churchills do we have?
Infinite.
Infinite? Some people say infinite minus 10. Whatever the case may be, practically we should be able to count how many Bob Churchills are in this room. But we can't. But in the mathematical realm of discussion and discourse, it exists because it has its own axioms and conventions. But in the real world, it leads to absurdities. Let's go to the second example. Say we have 100 Bob Churchills in this room. And at every possible moment, we add another Bob Churchill. Bob Churchill 101, Bob Churchill 102, Bob Churchill 1,000,001, and so on and so on. Am I ever going to reach a number of Bob Churchills that we could describe as infinite? No, because it's just potential in the real world. The infinite is never actualized. In light of this, mathematicians Casimir and Newman, they said, the infinite certainly does not exist in the same sense that we say there are fish in the sea. Also, David Hilbert, the famous German mathematician, he said the infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature, nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains the infinite to play is solely that of an idea. But let's go back to the question of an infinite universe. Past events are not just ideas, they're real things. Therefore, the number of past events in the universe cannot be infinite, and by rational necessity must be finite. So if that's the case, the universe began to exist. And if it began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause. This is also supported by astrophysical evidence, scientific evidence. Has everyone heard of the Big Bang? Put your hand up. Good. And it's not that thing that happens after too many curries, okay? Now, according to the Big Bang, or the hot standard model, physical time and space were created, and matter and energy were also created at a point which cosmologists call singularity. Now, in summary, Big Bang cosmology indicates that the universe began to exist. T is equal to 0. Also, John Boswell, the author of Stephen Hawking's universe, he states, the biggest misunderstanding about the Big Bang is that it began as a lump of matter somewhere in the void of space. It was not just matter that was created during the Big Bang, it was space and time that were created. So in a sense, that time has a beginning, space also has a beginning. So from a naturalistic perspective, the Big Bang would then imply that the universe was created out of nothing. But that goes against a key, irrefutable philosophical principle that says, out of nothing, nothing comes. It is no wonder P.J. Swart in his publication about time states, if there is anything we can find inconceivable, is that something could arise from nothing. Let's summarize the argument in a very simple way. 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2. The universe began to exist. 3. Therefore the universe has a cause. Thank you, the cause. But all we know from this argument is that there's a possible cause for the universe. It doesn't mean it's God, or Allah, or Jesus, or Buddha, or Richard Dawkins, okay? The God of atheism here. It doesn't mean it's any of these people or things or entities. But when we think about this cause, which philosophers call, when we apply conceptual analysis, we come to some startling conclusions. For instance, since this cause created time and space, it must be one. Because if we follow the philosophical principle Occam's razor, which says do not multiply entities beyond necessity, then this cause must be one. And it's the most simplest explanation. Other explanations provide more questions than they answer, so the best explanation philosophically is that this cause must be one. Also, this cause must be uncaused, due to the absurdity of an infinite regress of events, similarly with causes. This cause must be immaterial and transcendent, because if this cause created time and space, it therefore must transcend time and space. So in other words, it exists atemporally and non-spatially. So the logical conclusion is that this cause must therefore be immaterial, as material things exist within time and space. Significantly, brothers, sisters and friends, this cause must have a will. Why do I say this? Because if this cause is uncaused, therefore eternal, and it brought into existence a finite effect, in other words, the universe, therefore it must have chosen the universe to come into existence. And choice indicates a will. And a will means that you can have a personal relationship with personal agents within the universe. Therefore, upon conceptual analysis, we conclude what Islam concluded 1400 years ago with regards to the basic definition of God. In the Quran, the book of the Muslims, in the 112th chapter, it says, say, He is God, the one, the only, God the eternal, the absolute, He begets not, nor was He begotten, and there is nothing like unto Him. Exactly what we concluded. One, uncaused, immaterial, transcendent, and is a divine being. It has a will, therefore can have a relationship with humanity. Now let's respond to some atheist counter-arguments. First and foremost, the atheist may say, and I don't want to build a straw man here, but these are some of the general arguments that exist. They say, your first premise that whatever begins to exist as a cause is wrong. We can't accept it. And therefore it's not a sound argument. And I say, why? They say because the quantum vacuum, according to physicists, they claim that there's subatomic particles and events that come into being without any cause. And therefore things can come from nothing. But there's a problem here. Firstly, the claim is misleading. Because the vacuum is not nothing, it's a sea of fluctuating energy, it's a rich structure, and it obeys the laws of the universe. Also, there are many physicists that are adopting a deterministic view on in the quantum vacuum. So they say there are causes. that bring into effect these subatomic events. And this is why we have many interpretations like the David Bohm interpretation rather than the Copenhagen interpretation of thinking that things come out of nothing. Also, we have the other outdated atheist cliche, in my opinion, and it goes, who created God? Who created God? It's so outdated cliche that even the atheist philosopher Michael Rules in The Guardian, he said, I'm embarrassed when atheists say this, as if it's undermined the whole of theistic philosophy. And I agree with that atheist, with Professor Michael Rules. Because what we have to understand, the argument says, whatever begins to exist has a cause, not everything that exists. Also, we need to understand that the question itself denies our very existence. Because if we say what caused the cause for the universe, then what stops us from saying what caused the cause, that caused the cause, that caused the cause of the universe? Just carry on. Well, what caused that cause? That caused that cause, that caused that cause, that caused that cause, that caused that cause. I'm out of breath. If I did that forever ad infinitum, would we ever have an effect? No. So the question itself denies our very existence. Let's go to the second argument. God makes sense of the fine-tuning of the universe to permit life, to permit our existence. Now, how do we explain the order of the universe? The apparent fine-tuning of the cosmos to permit our existence, to permit your life. Now, surely to claim that they exist without any reason, without any purpose, is absurd. This is why Professor Penrose, he states, there is a certain sense in which I would say the universe has a purpose. And he argues that those who claim it's purposeless with regards to the fine-tuning, he says, I don't think that's a very fruitful or helpful way of looking at the universe. Now, why am I saying this? Because it seems more likely that a universe to prohibit life should exist than one that should permit life. Why? Why am I making this claim? Well, take this into consideration. The existence of life in this universe depends on an initial conspiracy of conditions and constants that must have been fine-tuned to a degree that's literally incomprehensible. And let's take some examples into consideration. Example number one being the expansion rate of the universe. If the expansion rate of the universe differed by more than 10 to the power of minus 18 seconds, which is 1 quintillionth of a second, we would not have the universe today. It would have recollapsed upon itself. Let's take a second example. Low entropy. Professor Roger Penrose of Oxford University, he states, in order to produce a universe resembling the one in which we live, the creator would have to aim for an absurdly tiny volume of the phase space of possible universes. This is scientific mumbo-jumbo. But let's ask the question, what is this volume? And according to Penrose, he calculates that this volume is 1 over 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. Again, he might not even know what this really means. Let me give you a practical example. Imagine I'm a dartsman. I have to hit the center of a proton if the universe was my dartboard. That is the reality. So there are three possible explanations for this fine-tuning of the universe. 1, physical necessity. 2, chance. And 3, design. And let's argue this together. Well, I would say it can't be physical necessity because these values are not dependent on the laws of nature. They're not contingent on the laws of nature. Also, it requires us to believe that a universe not fit for life would have been impossible. But if any of these constants and conditions and values were changed, even by a hair's breadth, the universe would not permit life. This is why scientist Paul Davies, he says, it seems then the physical universe does not have to be the way it is, it could have been otherwise. So we have no good reasons to accept that it's just there, it's just physical necessity. What about chance? It can be a chance, as many atheists claim. Well, this is not a rational explanation. We're talking about reason and rational thought here. Because the chances of the initial conditions for the universe to be life-permitting are so unlikely, it would have been impossible to use this as a sufficient explanation. Now, they may still say, well, it's still chance. Okay, well, would we argue such a thing if we found a 747 in our back garden? Or a grey rhino sleeping in our front lawn? Would we argue such a thing? Also, I would argue that claiming chance from this perspective goes beyond reason because it's something which the philosophers call epistemic probability, which basically means it's not accepting a probability like there may be aliens somewhere or a meteorite might come down and hover on top of us and open out, and then you have a bunch of chickens come out and they're green, and then behind them there's this big alien that has dreadlocks, and then he says, I don't know, take me to your leader. Or dealer, rather. I'm only kidding. So, it's not like that. It's rather beyond epistemic probability, something that we can't even fathom. And therefore, we can't have a conversation if you claim this as an explanation. Because you could claim anything. I could say, you know what, Peter, my mother, right, I don't think she's my mother anymore. I think she's a pink elephant that was born on Saturn, and she used to ski on the rings of Saturn. And one day she decided to fly here on a bunch of daisies. And you may think, comes to Tzortzis, you're a madman. And I would say, well, there's a chance. So it's counter-discourse, it's counterproductive. We can't have a conversation anymore. Also, I would argue it's not just about chance. It's about something called epistemic, actually specified probability, which is you have an improbability, but it has to include that it conforms to independent pattern. Let me give you an example. Say I'm a chimpanzee, okay? It's not very hard not to imagine, okay? And I'm typing away randomly for the whole day, and then you find me sleeping on the floor with a couple of banana skins around, okay? Soiled nappy, yeah? And then what happens is, on a piece of paper, you see, "O Romeo, O Romeo, wherefore art thou, O Romeo, deny thy father, deny thy name?" Or an Islamic version of it. "O Abdullah, O Abdullah, wherefore art thou, Abdullah, deny thy mother?" So the point is, you'll be thinking, wait, this is highly absurd, because I would expect to find words like house, door, cat, etc., etc. But since it's a Shakespearean play, it conforms to the independent pattern of the English grammar. So the most rational explanation is, the secretary of the ISOC, Sahela, she came overnight, sedated me, fed me bananas, right, and typed it herself. That would be a more reasonable explanation. Also, the chance hypothesis doesn't make sense because recently there was a study on this type of example. And do you know, the mathematicians, they said, do you know how long it would take the chimpanzee to write to be or not to be from Hamlet's play? Do you know how long it would take? You may guess someone. Few months, okay? Anyone else? 28 billion years. Do you know how old the universe is? 13.7 billion years. So to claim the chance hypothesis is equivalent of denying the very universe. So therefore we have sufficient reasons to believe that the universe was designed. Let me summarize the argument for you. 1. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to physical necessity, chance, or design. 2. It's not due to physical necessity or chance. 3. Therefore it's due to design. So we got 2 rational conclusions. So atheism is not the only rational conclusion. So I'll give you an alternative. You may not accept it, but it's based on reason. And what Bob Churchill may have to do, I don't want to teach him how to debate, but what he may have to do is not only deconstruct my argument, but construct another argument in favor of the atheist worldview. Now let me end with an existential point, which really means, what does it mean to exist? And the Quran, the book of the Muslims, is very profound that way, because it says to us as human beings, who are you? Are you just a product of random social events? Are you just a product of political pressure? Are you a product of society, of just biology? Then what makes you different? What makes you, you? Because you're no different than from a robot. You just put the social biological code in and you act accordingly. But the Quran elevates humanity and says, no, you transcend this reality. You need to think deeply. This is why it says in a profound way, are you going to follow your forefathers? Even if they were wrong? Really transcending that social pressure, which in reality, humanist morality, according to Peter Cave, which is the head of the British Human Association's Philosophers Group, he says our morality is based on fellow feeling. Well, fellow feeling was disastrous in Nazi Germany. We could discuss that later. So let's conclude with an existential point. Now, from an atheistic perspective, there's no ultimate meaning in life. Ultimate meaning. Because if our ends are the same, that we just pass out of existence, what meaning, ultimate meaning does it give our lives? Does it matter if we ever existed at all? This is why Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher, he said, I wish the universe didn't exist. And you know what he did? He wrote an essay on suicide. Also, there's no ultimate value for our life. There's subjective value, but no ultimate value. Because if our ends really end at the grave, we become worm buffet. Yeah? Worm buffet. Then it makes no difference if Bob Churchill was an angel and I was a devil. What value does it give the politician trying to find solutions for world peace or the biomedic trying to find cures to cancer? We're just going to die. What about objective moral values? You can't have objective moral values in absence of the divine. Because they're just rendered subjective. This is why the late philosopher J.L. Mackie, in his book Ethics, he says, there are no objective values. And he's very honest and sincere. That's the logical implication of the atheist worldview. Because God is the only concept that transcends human subjectivity. In absence of God as a rational basis for objective morality, you just have evolution of social pressure, and those things render morality empty. And almost an accidental byproduct of a social and biological process. Morality has evolved just like an ears or teeth, or your unwanted hair. That's the reality of morality, if you think about it, from a logical perspective. Also, and finally, there's no ultimate purpose. According to an atheist worldview, life is either purposeless, or according to Richard Dawkins in his book, The Selfish Gene, is to propagate our DNA. Well, he has justified polygamy in Islam. Because if our purpose is to propagate our DNA, then having more than one wife is actually an atheist moral. Wouldn't you agree, Bob?
I'll come back to you in the...
Oh, that's good. I think the only way an atheist could get out of this by giving an ultimate purpose for your life is saying, you know what? Just like Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist, he said, this world is nothing, it's meaningless, therefore it's a blank canvas, you give it meaning for yourself. What a self-delusion. That's almost saying, let's pretend to have purpose. Let's pretend to have ultimate purpose. So, it is no wonder the Quran says, respond to the call of God and His messenger to that which gives you life. Because if you respond to an atheist call, I would argue, do you really have life? Or is it just self-delusion? So, let me just summarize my presentation today. I think I've given cogent, positive arguments for the existence of God. God makes sense of the beginning of the universe. God makes sense of the fine-tuning of the universe to permit our existence. And I gave an emotional, existential argument at the end, which made us laugh, but should also make us think. As the Quran says, يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, for those who reflect. And we're reflecting human beings, we're not just products of our society, so we should think. And in the Q&A, I think we should follow the moral paradigm of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ when he said, the cure to ignorance is to ask and learn. So let's hope we proceed in that line. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, first speaker. I would like to remind you not to go for the suicide of atheists.
I didn't do that. It was Arthur Schopenhauer said that. It wasn't
not give bad ideas to people.
It wasn't me.
Now, we'll hear from the second speaker.
So, I have the unenviable task of defending a proposition which apparently only one other person in the room is prepared to stand up for. Clearly arrogant proposition. That's obviously not mine. I don't sort of, as a general rule, walk around in the streets finding sort of identifiably religious people and telling them atheism is the only rational conclusion. That's not the kind of thing people say, because obviously it sounds arrogant to say this is the only rational conclusion. It sounds like nothing else anyone has ever said is rational, sensible, or that you don't understand where it's coming from. It makes it sound like you're saying that the other person is an idiot, which is why it's not the kind of thing we normally say, and it's not the kind of thing that I would normally defend. But let's try and make something of it. I think that it doesn't need to be quite as harsh as it sounds. We all have views, and presumably, the reason we're talking about them at all, whether we say I believe in God or I don't believe in God, or I vote Labour or I don't vote Labour, is because we think that there is some merit in the particular choice and that we have got some merit detecting faculty that makes us pick that one out. In the case of something like a philosophical argument for the existence of God, we're saying that there are reasons to believe in it and that our rational faculties have allowed us to pick them out. So really, I sort of want to sort of collapse this down and maybe find more support by kind of putting the context of atheism as the only rational conclusion, make that context a little clearer. Because if all it's really saying is, well, this is my view, it's trivial that I therefore think it's the most rational option, in exactly the same way as someone saying, oh, I believe in God. Well, it's trivial that they're saying it's the most rational option. Presumably that's why they're not saying it's an arbitrary decision or a randomly chosen one. So I want to say that first. There's no meatier content to the claim that it's the most rational and just that that's what I think. That said, I don't think that we should ignore the title. Let's not make it just like God exists, no God doesn't, this argument's good, that argument's bad. The question has been asked in this imaginative way, which is the most rational. So let's talk about rationality. Now, I actually have a different view of rationality from what a lot of other people who would say, oh, I'm a critical thinker or I'm a rationalist, by which I mean religious and non-religious, what they would think of as rational. Traditionally, rationalism meant a sort of system-building approach to philosophy. People start with things like self-evident truths or undeniable first principles, and they kind of build with logic on top of those principles. They're a sort of magic bean, and they're building a sort of beanstalk of rationality, and they say that as long as my first principles are fairly certain, then obviously the system that I then build on top of that with logical deduction and so on, that must be sound. So this is the kind of approach to rationalism of sort of Leibniz and Descartes. It's the system that's a false attempt. We now genuinely regard as any attempt like that to sort of say, I'm going to found my worldview and then build on top of it, looks very bad. Today, rationalism just tends to mean something more like reason is involved in some way in working out what the best view is. That's the kind of merit that we're trying to detect with our merit detecting faculties of our brains to find which is the most reasonable, the most rational view. I think there's some very strange things about the way that we tend to do that, both religious and non-religious. We say things like, well, it's the most rational view because I've got good reasons for believing it, or I think that this evidence supports this view. We say things like, well, truth is what, to the best of our knowledge, is true. Say it's what's factually true to the best of our knowledge. I think that all these ways of thinking about rationality are actually deceptive because they all hark back to that older notion of rationalism, that you have to have some first principles and then build on them with rational deductive argument and create certainty. We know that old way of doing things was false. It's clearly false. You've got lots of different philosophers using lots of different first principles, building on top of them to produce these elaborate systems. They're all in contradiction with one another, and we can clearly look at that and say, well, clearly, no, this is the wrong way to go about it. That kind of foundationalism is the wrong way to go about building a philosophy. There is no certainty that you can come to just by abstractly a priori thinking about it. That's a strange way to go about things. Given that that's the case, there's something a bit strange about saying, well, I have partial support my theory. I have some views, some arguments, some evidence. Now, it's not sufficient to prove the case. It's not sufficient to make it certain. It's not supposed to justify it ultimately. But it supports it. What on earth does that mean? Normally, if someone says, I've got an argument in favour of my view, but it's not sufficient to actually prove it or support it, you go, well, then it's not partial justification at all. You haven't done anything. Like, if it's an invalid argument, it's an invalid argument. But sometimes when it's our own views, we like to say, okay, this isn't totally convincing, but I'm obviously partially supporting the view. So we come then to this idea that the truth, the thing that we're after, is just what is true to the best of our knowledge. And I think that's a very strange way of thinking about truth, because it contains within it itself, but adds this extra notion in that it's what's true to the best of our knowledge. I don't think that what is true to the best of our knowledge is truth at all. what is true, completely independent of our knowledge of it, completely independent of our reasons, our justifications. Any attempt to rationalise or think about it has no bearing at all on whether or not a statement is actually true. Sometimes we think we have very good arguments for something that is totally false, and we realise we've been barking entirely the wrong tree. I want to try and sort of demonstrate this with a few examples of what people give as good reasons, rational reasons for believing in things, whatever they are. So Sherlock Holmes is often held up as one of the exemplars of logic. He's the deductive reasoner, and he says, look, I can come along, I can see a situation, and I make conclusions. So if perhaps myself and a colleague or a friend turned up to a party and Sherlock Holmes was there, or perhaps a breakfast, a morning event, and he would go, okay, you know what, I can see that both of you have got slightly dishevelled clothing, you've both got the same consistency of scrambled egg about your person, and you both appear to have sort of unwashed hair. I deduce from these premises that you've got up together in a bed, having spent the night together, and that you're having an affair. That's the kind of thing that's a rubbish example, that's not the kind of thing Sherlock Holmes would do, but that is the kind of deduction that he thinks that he can make, that would then prove something. Now, of course, we know that there are going to be lots of other explanations, better explanations. Maybe we just both ate scrambled egg and are really bad at getting up in the morning, so we're always late for things and we always seem to turn up late at the same time. I think what this shows is that this idea of deduction is something where you can just pluck a few premises out of thin air and then go, oh, I'm going to use my reason and build on it and prove a point. Even though I'm supposed to be here defending rationalism and rationality, I think that's a deeply flawed way of thinking about what reason and what rationality are. These arguments based on premises where you just go to a conclusion. I want to give another example about that. So there's a very common notion in philosophy of this problem of induction, which is the idea that the way that we think and reason about the world is that we spot individual particular things like a white swan, another white swan, another white swan, and that we're able to induce, we just induct, and that's our conclusion, that all swans are white. And Hume said, no, that doesn't make sense, you can't just see a bunch of particulars and then extrapolate to a universal and claim that that's a conclusion. That's not logical. The reason it's not logical is because there's clearly a lot more in the conclusion than there is in the premise. You're making a much bigger claim about all swans that simply cannot be justified. There's no way of getting, there's no logical way of sort of formally writing out what an inductive argument is supposed to be. So that's a common notion in philosophy, this idea of the problem of induction. I think there's a much bigger problem, actually, for rationality, for any traditional notion of what the rational is, which is that there is a much less recognised problem of deduction. So the normal kind of thing that you think you're doing, oh, okay, I'm going to set up some premises, he's got scrambled egg on his chin, she's got scrambled egg on his chin. If they've both got scrambled egg on his chin, then this kind of thing happens. All that kind of line of reasoning suffers of the opposite problem from the problem of induction, which is that it suffers from content diminution. So the problem of induction is that your conclusion contains way more than it warrantably can. It extrapolates to a universal from just a few particulars. The problem of deduction is that your conclusion has to contain less information than it contains in your premises. If it doesn't, then it's obviously ampliative. So if, for example, I said that my inductive statement was that, okay, Plato was a man, Socrates was a man, Hume was a man, therefore all philosophers are men. We clearly go, okay, that's a bad argument, it's an inductive argument, and it's bad because that statement at the end, all philosophers are men, clearly contains more than it warrantably can based on those three particulars that we fed into it. But this parallel problem of deduction is that the other way around, you have to sort of say something like, okay, all philosophers are men, that would be your premise, and then you could deduce, you could validly deduce in formal logic from a statement like all philosophers are men, statements like Plato is a man, Socrates is a man, and so on. Of course it's wrong, it's a bad argument because the premise is wrong, but it's still valid. It would be valid to deduce from that Angie Hobbs was a man, because she's also a philosopher, so you could deduce bad things from it, but the point is that would be valid deductively. But all we can do is break down the deductive premises into stuff that is less. So the rationalist should rightly be left with a real problem. They think that argument and that logic are involved in establishing what is rational, that we have to justify the things that we say, and that we do that by using inductive arguments and by using deductive arguments, inductive arguments are just plain invalid, and deductive arguments are, by necessity, either invalid or uninformative. So, what does the rationalist then, that thinks that reason is involved in determining what conclusions are rational, what can he actually say? What can he rely on in this case? The view that's sort of developed over the last 50 years or so, in a large part, certainly of the philosophy of science, is that rather than trying to justify and warrant conclusions, simply arguing foundationally by unpacking premises into conclusions, is that what we actually do is make a bold conjecture apropos pretty much nothing, and then the process of rationality exists not in trying to justify it, but in trying to attack it and knock it down. It sounds a little arbitrary, but there's of course a reason for this. If you're trying to offer evidence in support of a conclusion, well, any evidence that you care to offer about anything could also be used in principle to establish any number of other arbitrary facts. There is always a possibility of modifying some theory that you're trying to prove with fact by duplicating it out, adding something weird and arbitrary on the end. So some supposed notion of support would also support some other view. Whereas when the opposite is true, when you're trying to falsify something, if it is the case that you have actually identified some negative evidence, some evidence against something, then it really does only take one correct and accurate piece of negative evidence to disprove a statement. So on this basis, the critical rationalist theory of rationalism says that all this old way of thinking, all those philosophers pretty much between Socrates and Popper, every theologian, every philosopher, every thinker that was trying to create some magic beans and build a theory by deduction on top of that, was doing something profoundly mistaken and impossible, a foundational justificationist rationalism, when what we actually do and what actually works is a critical rationalism that consists in laying bare our theories and saying, whatever they are, wherever you've plucked them from, the things that make it rational not to hold them are all negative. They're about, okay, does it fit the evidence? That's important. Obviously, if I propose something that jars with things we already know, then that seems like a bad sign. But primarily, we should be interested in whether or not there is something that will count against it. Not whether it can be argued for, but whether or not there is something that can be used to say, no, that's wrong. This piece of evidence that I'm proposed falsifies or refutes your given theory, whether it's a scientific theory, a philosophical theory, whatever it is. I think that we can then start to think about the things that make a theory rational to hold, to propose, but then to actually hold in perpetuity. We can ask on this model where positive support, like deductive arguments, where that model is rejected, we can ask, okay, does the theory fit the evidence? Is it falsifiable? But also, does it solve anything? What is the point of this theory? What intellectual problem or what scientific problem is it trying to solve? There's no point, you can have a theory of anything abstract that, on Jupiter there are invisible beings. Well, it doesn't solve any problem for us because we can't go and falsify it, but we don't care if they're invisible and they're very far away. As of yet, it's solving no intellectual problem to propose that they're invisible beings. If something started to happen, if radio signals started to come from Jupiter that we couldn't explain, then we might say, okay, maybe there are invisible living things there that are projecting these radio signals at us. Then it would become an interesting thing to think and believe. So, my view, what makes for me atheism the rational conclusion is that when we think about any form of theism which is proposing that there is a God, it is failing to meet these sort of minimum requirements of things we've developed as ways of assessing whether something is a suitable theory for philosophy or for science. We can say, okay, what problem is it actually solving? What intellectual problem is there that there is solving? We can say, what on earth makes it falsifiable? What could possibly count against it? It seems like any combination of events can occur, any disasters, any internecine fighting can occur, and we still never give up this idea that God exists. So it seems like it's irrefutable. So the big revelation of this way of thinking is that any theory which doesn't even impinge on the world enough that something can happen that will slap back its tentacles and make it retreat away is a very strange kind of theory. It seems to have no empirical content at all. There's nothing that will count against it. Why on earth would we consider such a theory that makes no predictions that could stand against it? We mentioned Occam's razor before. I think that this is a way of thinking about rationality that really melted that. So once we've got these criteria of what makes something a rational theory, that it should fit the existing evidence, but also that it should solve some intellectual problem, and that it should be falsifiable, that it should be refutable. Occam's razor is coming in and saying, well, look, we don't multiply entities beyond necessity. We don't need this theory. It's not doing anything. It impinges on the world not at all, and it doesn't solve any problems. So as a methodological preference, we can simply reject it. None of this necessarily means that the existence of God as a conjecture is necessarily false, but it certainly does, I think, mean that atheism is the most rational option. I don't think it is the case, as we said before, that atheism is a knowledge claim that there is no God. It's a response to the claim that there is a God. It's a kind of a null hypothesis. When we're left with being able to say, look, theism is solving no problem, fails to impinge on the world, and can simply be rejected as a methodological notion, then atheism is not some alternative knowledge claim, it's just what's left, having rejected that false claim. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Now we're going to the rebuttal part. And we're going to rebuttal. So each speaker will have 8 minutes. We'll be starting with thank you. So you go.
Thank you very much, Bob. Bob raised some very interesting points. I agree with some of them. I actually do agree with some of them. However, in order for us to have a more fruitful debate, I think we should be slightly less abstract. I think what Bob needs to do, and I hope he does it in his rebuttal, so then we could take it further into the question and answers, is show how the first 2 arguments I proposed were actually not strong arguments. Because not only are the arguments sound, but they're also valid. You also spoke about rationalism and your definition of it. And I think you were leaning towards naturalism. Now, I have a problem with that, because you were saying the question of God, trying to prove God's existence, does it answer any question? Is it practical rather? Well, I think it is, because it answers an existential question. What does it mean to be me? Do we have a true sense of ultimate purpose, ultimate meaning? Something that many people question all the time, even Leibniz. You mentioned Leibniz. He said the first question that should be asked and answered is, why does something exist rather than nothing? That's a practical question. That's an existential question too, about your place in the universe. You can't assume everyone is an emotive, cold, abstract object, an entity that just happens to be an accident, a miscarriage of nature, yeah? Thrust into the purposeless of the world. That's not a right way of looking at things. I think it's quite dangerous as well. It's very bleak. So the question of God actually answers an existential question, which is very profound and very important. Now you say, we need some empirical content, but that's a very crude way of looking at rationalism and thinking. Because you can't prove everything via empirical content. Actually, the statement itself denies your very existence. Because let's empirically verify if we had a great grandmother. We don't have access to her DNA, we don't have access to her grave, or anything like that. So how can we verify she existed? I want you to answer this question actually in the audience. How do you know she existed? Because we're here, which is not an empirical claim. That's actually a rational claim. So empiricism itself is self-defeating in many ways. Also, if you presume scientific naturalism to be the only method to form conclusions about life, you have huge problems. Because scientific naturalism can't even justify morality. Then what does it mean to say to your wife, j'adore, or je t'aime, or I love you? The last thing you want to say is, you know what, it's just chemicals in your brain. Then you get a big, nice, juicy backhand. Yeah? So the point I'm trying to make is, scientific naturalism is also self-defeating, because saying scientific naturalism is a way to form sound conclusions can't be proven by scientific naturalism itself. Also, scientific naturalism can't even prove logical truths, like numbers. And you need numbers and logical truths before you have science in the first place. And to argue the other way around would be like a dog trying to catch his tail. So, scientific naturalism does have its problems too. So I think what we should do is use a whole range of methodologies to form conclusions about life. And I don't think there's anything wrong with epistemic foundationalism or rational foundationalism. You have some key concepts in life that are true and sound, and you build upon them, because what you've done, you've actually denied your own method of thinking. Because scientific naturalism has a concept, has a basic principle that is based upon, that you can't even prove. For example, the real world exists. I want you guys to prove to me that the real world actually exists. Go, now, 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You can't, can you? How can you prove that? How can you prove my head is hollow, or I have a brain, or I'm physical? Because it's an underlying assumption. In philosophy, you call it a basic philosophical principle that you take into play. And the whole of scientific naturalism is based upon that assumption. You don't know if your brain is in Mars and you have some aliens putting probes in it and make you think the way you think. You don't know that. Do you know that? Or maybe, I don't know, maybe. I don't know. Yeah? So you're confused. So the point is, even your own view in rationalism is problematic too, because it's based upon a certain principle that you can't even prove. So it was interesting points you made, but I don't think they actually in any way suggest that the arguments we posed today for the existence of God are actually not sound arguments. So I think I've dealt with most of your presentation here. So it's useful for me to add just another funny thing. Another counter-argument to the second argument I proposed, which could be found in Richard Dawkins' book called The God Delusion, in page 157 to 158. He says, well, there's a problem. Who designed the designer? Yeah? Now, the way we could respond to this as theists is to say, well, the argument is an inference to the best explanation. And therefore, the best explanation doesn't require an explanation too. Because in the philosophy of science, as Bob May confirmed, is that the best explanation doesn't require an explanation. For example, say we're all astronauts, archaeologists, okay? Astronaut archaeologists. And we go to the dark side of the moon, and we're digging away, and we find BlackBerry, iPhone, iPhone chart, the iPhone 4, the BlackBerry, and other things. The best explanation is there must have been a civilization here. But then you get Richard Dawkins V coming along in his spacesuit saying, you can't claim these things, because you don't know their names, you don't know where they came from, etc., etc. But then, does that undermine our conclusion, our best explanation that there was a civilization? No. Also, that type of questioning undermines science itself. Do you know that? Because if you say there needs to be an explanation for the best explanation, then what about the explanation for the explanation that is for the best explanation? Oh, what about that explanation that requires an explanation for the explanation that's supposed to explain the best explanation? And if it goes on forever, sir, for kindly interrupting, if that goes on forever, sir, are we ever going to have an explanation? No. So, it's interesting points you raised, but I don't think you provided a philosophically undercutting defeaters to our argument. Maybe you're saving it for this part, which I hope you are, and when you do provide them, we'll have a very positive question and answers. Thank you very much for listening.